I know what you're thinking. Wait, shouldn't BloodRayne 2 be next on the list? Well, sorry kids, but you just been betrayed. Don't look so shocked. You had to learn about it sometime. Look, I had to make this intro bleed into the title somehow, okay? Your only other option was sitting through a 5-minute TED talk on how this game is a hack and slash platformer. You're welcome. Alright, it's been a while since we last covered the BloodRayne series. Naturally, you think we jump right into BloodRayne 2 next, but that video is going to take a little bit longer. This game, on the other hand, is really small. So for now, let's just pretend it takes place between the first and second game. Trust me, the plot here isn't that strong to stop you from believing that, but we'll get to that later. First, let's dig into some background on Betrayal. If you end up enjoying this video, how about trying to take a look at our backlog of content? It might be something you might like there. If not, we'll be more than happy with a thumbs up on your way out, or even a subscription, if you make it to the end of the video, that is. Make us work for it. Thanks for watching, and let's continue.
After BloodRayne 2 in 2004, the franchise went quiet. Developer Terminal Reality moved on and the series was dragged through the mud through those infamous Uwe Boll movies. By 2009, the brand was bruised and the market had shifted, and Majesco needed a new plan. Instead of going bigger, Majesco decided to go smaller and stranger. Their solution? Hand the IP over to WayForward Technologies, the studio best known for Shantae and Contra 4. A team famous for razor-sharp 2D platforming and gorgeous animation taking on the blood-soaked vampire action series might sound like a weird fit, but they definitely had a vision. WayForward kept Laura Bailey as the voice of Rayne. Hold up, future Madhouse here. In the 2011 version of the game, Rayne was voiced by Jesse Seeley. Laura Bailey was brought back for the Fresh Bites version. We kinda got confused there, thank you. But just about everything else got tossed. This new Rayne was snarkier, more of a groundhouse anti-hero than the brooding femme fatale. The art style, bold, stylized, high contrast and drowning in gore, because subtlety clearly wasn't on the menu. This project would eventually become BloodRayne Betrayal. Like most games, Betrayal started off bigger than what we got. Earlier design dock shows levels of branching paths, so less hallway, more maze. But that ambition hit the cutting room floor. Multiple equipable weapons and a wider range of enemies, gone. There was even a scrap gimmick where the screen would get progressively bloodier as you rack up kills. Sounds cool, right? Yeah, too bad it probably made it impossible to see anything. In September 2011, BloodRayne Betrayal launched on the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. The visuals, gorgeous. The soundtrack, absolutely killer, and the difficulty, brutal-ish. Some players loved this precision and challenge, others bounced off the difficulty wall so hard they left an imprint. But over time, Betrayal carved out his own cult following. Then in 2021, Ziggurat Interactive gave it another shot, with BloodRayne Betrayal Fresh Bites. A remastered director cut featuring rebalanced difficulty, upgraded visuals, and extra voice work. That will be the version we'll be sinking our teeth into here.
The plot of Betrayal is very simple, much like the other games in the series. When it first came out, I never heard it described as a reimagining or reboot of the franchise, so I always thought and assumed it was a bridge between the first and second titles, which makes a fair amount of sense considering there's more than a 7-decade time gap between the two. And yeah, the comics are probably set somewhere within that span, but there's nothing wrong with Betrayal existing there as well. So yeah, that's how we're gonna justify this video coming up before BloodRayne 2 in the wider TCB canon.
That is shocking to you, then so be it.
With all that coping and historical revisionism out the way, the real question is what the game is actually about. Rayne is contracted by the Brimstone Society to assault a massive gothic fortress where her father Kagan is hiding out. The Society sends in a squad of human soldiers to assist her. Spoiler alert, they're mostly cannon fodder. Their purpose is to show just how terrifyingly lethal the castle is and how much cooler Rayne is by comparison. I mean, it's supposed to be that, but that's entirely dependent on how good you actually are. Otherwise, you'll probably look just as bad as them, except with a health bar. Speaking of playing well, before we head towards the castle, let's go over the general gameplay of Betrayal. BloodRayne 1 was basically a boomer shooter with some hack and slash elements. The game seems to want you to rely on your arm blades as your primary weapons, but the other weapons you were given were just way too powerful. You can wipe out waves of enemies far faster than with melee, unless you were using the high level strategy of popping blood rage, which is basically how you deal with anything that didn't go down in more than 2 hits. I mean, if you don't count the last boss, which is half pop blood rage and half crappy puzzle boss. All in all, the combat generally works the way it's supposed to. BloodRayne 2, without tipping our hand too much about how we feel about it before its actual video, looks at surface level like the opposite of the first game. It trades the powerful range options of the original for a much stronger emphasis on melee combat. Sure, Rayne still had our projectiles with our blood guns, but let's be real, they weren't very good. By this point, the series was drifting closer into a character action territory. Trying to hop onto that already moving Devil May Cry train, the first game skipped. To their credit, or maybe just pure luck, that same DMC train derailed spectacularly with its own sequel. You know, the one where the supposed characters all have the charm of planks of wood, and you spend about 85% of the game whacking away at military hardware. So this brings us to Betrayal itself, which I'd rarely describe as a mix between a 2D Devil May Cry and Castlevania. The shift to side-scrolling pushed the series further away from giving Rayne any meaningful range options. Your default handgun is about what you get for most of the game. And sure, it's a powerful attack capable of taking out multiple enemies at once, but most of the time, it's just used for hitting distant foes or carving out a bit of breathing room. For the first time in the series, melee is truly king. And when it comes to slashing, Rayne doesn't have a huge number of combos to choose from. She's basically working with a basic 4-hit string. The end of the combo can be swapped out depending on whether you press the button briefly before the final strike or hit a directional button letting you slightly vary the attack to suit the situation. Honestly, you wouldn't need a ton of fancy moves anyway, because Rayne's dashing attack is downright ridiculous. Fast startup, quick recovery, insane range and damage, and it even stuns enemies, letting you link into another dash attack. Pound for pound, it's the best attack in the game, no contest. She also gets her returning bite command grab, turning most enemies into mobile health packs, and now she can make them explode on command. It's a pretty sweet addition to our move pool and comes in handy for crowd control, especially if you're running low on ammo for your gun. So yeah, she definitely has a few new tricks, but overall Rayne feels a little bit more limited than in previous games. You may think that's just because of the series move to a 2D perspective, but it's mostly due to the new focus on combat. Everything is built around timing, positioning, and making the most of the moves that you actually have. From the very moment enemies appear on screen, the player is basically put on a timer. You're tasked with clearing battles as effectively as possible, managing resources, gauging enemy threat levels, navigating environmental hazards to use to your advantage, and killing targets in the most unique way possible to rack up points to your overall score. Because yup, you're on a scoring system now. This makes every encounter feel like a puzzle to optimize rather than just a meaningless progression block. Actually, kind of like a more focused version of how combat was handled in the first game. I think this focus on the option of more methodical combat is a big reason why Betrayal left so many sour tastes in reviewers' mouth. Many assume fights could be button mashed without any thought, and sure, you can get away with that, but only if you understand enough about the game to exploit it. It's not a steep learning curve, just a bit tricky, and I'm sure a lot of players confuse challenge with a demand for optimization, feeling overwhelmed when the game was really just asking them to think a little more. With all that out the way, let's actually dive into the first section of the game, which has Rayne exploring the outer areas of the castle. And yeah, it's about what you'll expect from a generic courtyard outside a generic vampiric castle. Tombstones, statues, stone walkways, and what I think are gazebos? I don't know. The whole area is just dripping with gothic architecture with some moody background vista of the looming fortress. But honestly, the most important thing here isn't the set dressing, it's that giant, weirdly closed moon hanging in the sky. You know the one, the same massive anime moon that shows up in certain media every once in a while. Why is it practically brushing up against Earth's surface? Wouldn't that be like an actual geological problem? Anyway, once you finally get control of Rayne, the game tosses a couple waves of enemies at you to break into combat. These are your basic vampire colonial guys that make up the bulk of what you'll be fighting. Betrayal has fewer than a dozen enemy types across its 15 levels, so yeah, expect some repetition. After, the level will give you a little room to get used to the platforming and movement, while introducing these little floodlights that will damage you slowly if stood under. They're pretty much the stand-in for the water hazard from the first game. They can be destroyed for a small amount of points or can be ignored, but they will be thrown in the combat section, so make sure you get them out the way if you're still having issues getting the hang of the combat. You'll also be finding treasures of various sizes that can be destroyed for a good chunk of points as well. Level 2 is pretty much more of the same, though it does mix things up by introducing a couple of new enemy types. You'll run into these little electrical frog things that like to skitter around and zap you. as well as the flying parasites, annoying but also useful since you can foot stomp them to chain together extended platforming segments. This is also the point where the game introduces its one and only collectible, the red skulls. These are tucked away in slightly hidden or off-path areas, and if you manage to gather 5 of them, you'll be rewarded with an upgrade. The game lets you choose between increasing ammo or increasing health. Now that may sound like a tough decision, but it really isn't once you understand how the game is designed. To make things easier, just dump most of your early skulls into health. The game is brutal and survivability is worth way more than style points if you're still wrapping your head around the combat, especially when hazards are chewing you up as enemies pile on. A couple extra health bars here and there will save you tons of frustration. Ammo upgrades, they're fine, just don't overdo it. The gun is already strong enough for lining up multi-kills, displacing enemies, and bailing you out when things get messy, but it's not the backbone of Rayne's kit. One upgrade to make dealing with flyers or tough situations a little easier, but past that, you're better off putting your skulls to mainly health. If you keep an eye out for all 30 skulls though, you'll be able to max out both health and ammo by the end of the game. So I guess that point is moot if you're eagle-eyed enough. Overall, I'm not really a fan of the upgrade system, at least in its current form. Finding skulls hitting around levels is fine and all, but since the game is so heavily centered around combat, it feels like they would have made more sense as a reward for landing S ranks. As it stands, there's no real incentive to chase them outside of just personal pride. On top of that, the system could have used a little more variety. Adding a third upgrade path, like a straight damage boost, would have gone a long way, especially since enemies get increasingly spongy in later stages. Or better yet, maybe let players stockpile skulls for something bigger later, like an item to help find or track down items a little easier. Just a little more choice would have helped make the system feel a lot less flat. Rayne and whoever's left from Brimstone finally tracks down the entrance to the castle, only to be ambushed by the first boss, the Crab Puncher. Now, I've been playing this game for over a decade and I can get the logic behind this fight, but for the life of me, I can never walk away without taking a hit. The setup is simple, destroy all 4 of its legs to win. Easy enough, right? Well, not exactly. You've got those annoying parasites swooping in non-stop, Crab Puncher spinning around with its saw blades and random chunks of rocks falling from above to keep you on your toes. The whole thing turns out to be this chaotic mess where flawless victory feels almost impossible. That said, it's not actually a hard fight, just a noisy one. Rayne wrecks the robot, but since she's already too deep underground to just pop back up to use the castle door, she has no choice but to take a more dangerous route instead.
Starting off in total darkness, Rayne finds herself in a network of caverns underneath the castle, I think. There are rocks and stalagmites in the background, sure, but the place is still loaded with traps. So maybe the vampires just set dress their basement this way on purpose? I gotta give them credit if that's the case because they really thought ahead on the shooter prevention. Anyway, this is where the game starts to crank up the challenge with more precise platforming. Tossing spike litter jumps at you that demand tighter inputs. On the top of that, waves of enemies are now a mix of more lethal hazards, forcing you to juggle combat while avoiding instant death pits and crushing spike traps. Of course, if you're clever, you can flip this around. Bait enemies into traps and let the environment do half the work for you, saving you time for that sweet bonus. I think Betrayal's whole approach to combat, making you juggle enemies and hazards at the same time, does help it stand out compared to a lot of other games in this lane. Honestly, I can't think of another title that leans into this dynamic quite like this. And if for some reason the idea of tossing bad guys into environmental traps hasn't sunk in yet, the game straight up forces a lesson on you by dropping a crosshair in your path and making you shuck dudes into it to move forward. Now that I'm thinking about it, this kind of environmental interaction was a huge focus back in BloodRayne 2. So WayForward did do their homework when building a combat here. In a weird way, it really does feel like a mashup of the first 2 games' philosophies. BR1's raw hack and slash chaos, paired with BR2's environmental finishers. Funnily enough, I didn't make that connection until writing the script. I don't know, man. I came in thinking Betrayal's combat was kind of mid, but honestly, I'm starting to change my mind. A little later on, Rayne has to fend off waves of enemies while standing on his makeshift platform of bones, I think. Whatever they are, they float for some reason, which is convenient because the entire room starts filling up with blood. And don't ask me where the blood is coming from because I got nothing. I guess depending on the way you feel about it, this might fall under the rule of cool. What doesn't fall under the rule of cool is later on in the stage, where you'll have to start dodging these stupid wall-mounted cannonballs that turn this badass underground castle stage into stage 1-4 for Super Mario Bros. At the end of the third level in this section, Rayne runs into the crab puncher again. Already, it's been about 5 levels of we're recycling boss fights, and it's only the second boss fight. Yeah, there's a little twist this time. You gotta use that trick you just learned. Detonate and a bite to break through the rock shielding his weak point, but come on, you're not fooling me, it's basically the same fight. I will say though, watching Rayne bust out the coffin drill to dig through it was a nice little reward. I was going for sarcasm there, but nah, I genuinely like that bit. Metal as fuck. The action continues with Rayne getting stuck in a single room, while out of nowhere a random white raven swoops overhead. Okay, I guess we're doing this now? Suddenly, Betrayal turns into Flappy Birds, except with an invincible dodge roll and a Banshee Scream attack. While doing whatever this is, the Raven spawns on Kagan, fusing a bunch of his minions together into one massive creature. At least, I think that's what's happening, it's not exactly clear. Then the Raven swings back to warn Rayne to her dad's hair. You know, the thing we already knew from the start. Their little shack get cut short when those newly fused monster things come crashing in to throw down with Rayne. Rayne cuts them down and move on. Those bloodsack monsters are now added to the regular enemy roster. There's not a whole lot to say about them, same deal as everyone else. Spam dash till they pop. If I had to give them something, I'd say they're kind of cute. I mean, yeah, in verse they're supposed to be gross abominations, but the stubby limbs and that random tiny hammer, they're more doofy than terrifying. After this, the game starts to get a little samey. Sure, you get the occasional locked door or laser gimmick tossed in and mix things up, but it's nothing worth dwelling on. So let's just fast forward to the actual next story beat, or boss fight, because that's where things start to pick up again. At this point, Rayne unceremoniously entered the castle, just in time to catch her father giving his minions the big old pep talk. This starts the final section of the game, so before we get into it, let's take a break and talk about something that's been bothering me. At this point, you guys should have more of an idea of what Betrayal is. I guess I can finally say what's been on my mind. This game is just plain strange. Not strange in a fun, quirky sort of way, strange in a who exactly is this for kind of way. You can't really talk about Betrayal without looking back at BloodRayne 2, because that game's underperformance is the domino that tipped all of this over. And honestly, it's not too hard to see why BR2 flopped. By late 2004, the industry has already leveled up. Ninja Gaiden showed what cutting edge melee combat can look like, while DMC 3 was right around the corner, ready to completely erase the bad taste of DMC 2. At the same time, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and Spider-Man 2 had players hooked on open world freedom, and the shooter crowd was locked down with Halo 2, Half-Life 2, and Doom 3. Against that lineup, BloodRayne 2 landed with all the impact of a wet napkin. It wasn't terrible, but it already felt like a middleware relic the day it hit the shelves. And that's where Betrayal comes in. Majesco looked at the market, looked at the sinking numbers and realized, okay, trying to compete directly isn't working. So instead of doubling down, they handed the keys over the way forward, the Shantae people, and let them completely reinvent the series. The result, a sharp pivot from the 3D grindhouse hack and slash to a 2D gothic action platformer. Bold, sure. Logical, debatable. Obviously Betrayal failed, judging by the fact that it's still the series' last new release, updated versions notwithstanding. And I think the core reasons why Betrayal failed was the pivot itself. They stripped away the only thing BloodRayne had going for it, because it definitely wasn't the gameplay, it was its personality. The campy grindhouse vibe, the pulpy edge, gone. Replacing Laura Bailey with Jessie Seeley was a weird take, but she barely talked anyway, so that was a waste. Hell, Bailey barely blabbed in this version of the game. All the stuff that made the series stand out in the sea of other action titles got sanded down to something flatter. Literally. And that's a brutal misstep, because if there's ever a moment for the series to lean harder to its identity to survive, it was right here, in the mid-2000s gauntlet of industry-shaking releases. Instead, Betrayal tried to reinvent BloodRayne into something it never was. At the exact moment, it needed to double down on being itself. I don't know if a hypothetical BloodRayne 3 with a proper split shine across the board, story, characters, level design, combat would have been enough to weather the colossal storm of both DMC 3 and Ninja Gaiden, but I hazard a guess that it could have bought the series a little more time in the cultural zeitgeist. Then again, the Oibo movies would probably kill the series anyway. Huh. Maybe this fate was inevitable.
Let's talk about the presentation, and on that front, Betrayal is kind of a weird beast. On the surface, the game is gorgeous. Slick HD visuals, sharp animations, lots of gothic flourishes, and an awesome amount of gore that absolutely pops on screen. It's easily the prettiest the series has ever looked. But here's the thing, it doesn't really feel like BloodRayne. Like, the style is more Saturday morning horror cartoon than Buffy Blade like pulp. And while not bad per se, it strips away the identity the franchise has carved out for itself so far. Rayne herself may be the biggest offender here. This is the most vanilla she's ever looked. Her design of Betrayal feels like a watered down parody of her older appearances. Gone is the over the top femme fatale energy baked right into her look, and instead we get a quiet grunt girl who looks like a G.I. Joe character or a fucking Silverhawk. I mean, it's serviceable, sure, but serviceable is not what Rayne should ever be. I get she needs to be simpler to keep things clear and trackable during gameplay, but damn guys, give her a corset at the very least. And then there's the music. On its own, the soundtrack is fantastic. High energy, fast paced, with the kind of intensity that you will find in a Arc System work game such as BlazBlue. Once again, Jake Kaufman doesn't miss when it comes to the music as a standalone, but it doesn't fit BloodRayne. The series used to live in this sleazy, grindhouse-inspired world dripping with atmosphere, lots of rave music and techno, but dropping a flashy anime fighter soundtrack feels like the worst kind of genre transplant. It's great music for another game, but for BloodRayne, it's just another reminder how hard Betrayal was trying to be something that it wasn't. Sound design wise, Betrayal is fine. The hits have some weight, the slicing sounds sound sharp enough, and the enemies cough up the usual groans, screeches, and gore bursts when they go down. It all gets the job done. But here's the thing that always bugged me with this game. Both versions actually. Let Rayne talk more. Although Rayne was voiced by a different actress for the 2011 version, Bailey was brought back on board for fresh bites, and is easily the smartest decision made here, but she's barely utilized. A huge chunk of the Order game's personality came from Rayne running her mouth, quipping, taunting, I swear even dropping the occasional pop culture reference. She was basically Gex with tits. In Betrayal though, you can go whole stretches without her saying a single word, and it makes the presentation feel hollow. Here, I'll splice in some talking into the clips of gameplay, and you guys in the comments can let me know if it helps with the presentation and brings it closer to the rest of the series.
Thanks for dragging me out here. And there's my invitation. It'll be very warm where you're headed. Damn bloodsuckers, they should have more sense. Guns are fine, but nothing beats blades in close combat. It's been fun.
If Bailey had recorded more lines and Rayne was allowed to eject that sarcastic and irreverent personality back into combat, the sound design would have clicked better with the series' DNA. Instead, the silence leaves the game feeling like it's missing a vital layer of its personality, even though everything else is technically sound. A major theme I'm starting to connect to Betrayal is the concept of identity, and if I had to compare this franchise to anything right off the top of my head, it might be the Dead or Alive games. The way Betrayal sanded down BloodRayne's identity reminds me a lot of what happened there. The first few DOA games knew exactly what they were, flashy, fast-paced fighters with a distinctive personality. Yeah, they leaned harder to their own brand of access, but that was the point. By the time we got to DOA 6 though, the series had been so stripped back and corporate polished that it barely resembled what made it special in the first place, although I still think the gameplay was pretty solid. It lost its edge though, the style, and the reason people even paid attention to it. And that's the exact trap BloodRayne fell into with Betrayal. Instead of doubling down on what little unique things the series had going for it and running with them, the devs, either intentional or unintentionally, smoothed everything out into something safer, cleaner, and way less memorable. It isn't a one-for-one comparison, of course. BloodRayne Betrayal can be seen as a franchise being handed off to a solid but ultimately unfitting team for the job, while the DOA series mostly stayed with the same developers and actively decided to gut what made it stand out in order to come off as more mainstream or esports safe. Whatever they were going for. The point is the same. Taking away a piece of media's personality is always a kiss of death for most franchises. Few, and I mean very few IPs can get away with something like this. Just like with DOA 6, this game shows what happens when a series tries to reinvent itself, when maybe staying the same was probably the best move it could have made. Finally back with Rayne, it's her turn to do some eavesdropping on her dear old dad. Except, hold up. Let's pump the brakes here for a second one more time. At the start of the video, I mentioned how Betrayal could slot neatly between the two main games, and that this was our justification for covering this before its actual sequel. But here's the problem. This guy, Kagan, he's barely even a character in this game. So to make things work in our timeline just a little better, we're going to tweak a few things. Instead of Rayne hunting down her father, she's after one of her half-siblings instead. Boom, problem solved. From this point on, this dude is no longer Kagan, he's Da-Malcom. So now that we cleared that up, let's hear what Da-Malcom has to say to his loyal army of like 3 guys copied and pasted over and over again.
What's driving me crazy is that photo right there. Zoom in on that. It's one of those cops in a black uniform with a mustache. You know that guy's a coward. You know he's a piece of garbage. You know he's weak. Oh, he'd love it. Those are the type of people that go to the cops in Oklahoma and say, "We'll kill your wives if you expose we did this." And the cops all just roll over to it. "Oh, you got a mustache. I'll just worship you. Oh, you got a mustache. It's okay. Oh, your demonic little mustaches." Nothing against mustaches, just all these cops are a little homoerotic gang of mustaches.
Yes, the usual bargain bin villain stuff. Da-Malcom wants to rip the world away from mankind and hand it over to the vampires, and also those green scyther looking dudes. I think they're supposed to be vampires, not sure. Either way, he caps it off with his big move, raising Castlevania. Not sure if the castle is supposed to be symbolic or just dramatic, but hey, it's go time. Meanwhile, Rayne's casually deactivating some security lasers while listening in. Then the castle's rising somehow causes the roof to collapse, because of course it does, and just like that, Da-Malcom gives his half-sister a warm family greeting by throwing endless enemy waves at her, before getting involved himself by throwing down a demon's heart that creates a monster made of blood. This serves as the third boss. Seriously, I'm kinda disappointed it isn't just Crab Puncher again. The Crimson Demon boss fight is fine, just fine, which is kinda sad because it also happens to be the best boss fight in the game. Compared to the tight and satisfying combat, Betrayal's bosses just don't hold up. This one boils down to just waiting for the thing to finally commit to its sluggish attacks, and then chipping away at its health bar. The only real challenge is when it disappears into the blood, forcing you to guess which direction its sweeping bite attack is coming from. And honestly, that's even more cheap than clever. So yeah, it's fine. Pretty much sums it up. After defeating the Crimson Demon, the floor/roof, depending on your perspective, I guess, breaks again. Why is this stuff breaking so easily? Did he order this castle from Fingerhut or something? The Raven guy from earlier finally reveals his human form and swoops in to catch Rayne. Apparently he thinks he's earned himself a little reward because he just zeroes in on her ass before leaving without saying much else. Rayne mutters a quiet thank you long after he's gone, and then is right back to the long stretch of jumping and killing things. The Poison Hall shakes things up with a neat little set piece where you're forced to hop across floating corpses, including the ones you just made yourself, to cross a pool of poison. After that, Rayne and the Raven guy, seriously, do we ever get a name for him? Starts teaming up, flipping switches for each other until Rayne finally nabs the game's one and only different rage weapon, the Sun Gun. I don't really get why a location crawling with vampires, or at least vampire adjacent creatures, would have a weapon specifically designed to blast one of their biggest weaknesses lying around their base. Like, who thought that was a good idea? Still, I guess stashing it here is better than leaving it somewhere completely random. The Sun Gun, unlike the handgun, comes with unlimited ammo, but don't expect anywhere near the same stopping power or instant chunk of damage the handgun delivers. Instead, it lights some enemies on fire, causing them to panic and run headfirst into their buddies, spreading damage around. Other than those guys, everyone else just kind of explodes. Honestly, still a solid trade-off and a decent range chipping option. I like it, plus it vibrates. The stun gun ends up being your go-to for switch hitting puzzles, and at this point, since Rayne pretty much has all of her tools, the game starts throwing everything at you. Every progression blocking gimmick you've seen before and every enemy type back to back. I thought this would be tedious, but honestly, the final stretch is the best part of the game. And this is where the titular Betrayal kicks in. Raven Guy, who still doesn't have a name by the way, flips a switch and nothing happens. And then he just kind of bells. Immediately after Da-Malcom teleports in, did the switch call him? Did the Raven Guy sell Rayne out? Who knows, it's never really made clear. Anyway, this triggers what should feel like a climactic battle between Da-Malcom. Instead, you slog through an enemy gauntlet while dodging his random pot shots. And then he steps in personally, and what's his big move? He fires contra balls. Then a bigger contra ball, and that's it. No new patterns, no phases, no real escalation, it's dull. But hey, at least you get the chance and the pleasure to slowly whittle him down with the stun gun's pea shooter damage. That's neat, I guess. And the cherry on top? It's one of those boss fights, the kind where you finally whittle a guy's health down only for the story to instantly rob you of the win in the most contrived way possible. In this case, Da-Malcom just shrugs and fires some fuck off lightning bolt at you, and Rayne gets knocked out cold long enough for his goons to drag her away. Real satisfying payoff, huh? Why couldn't the floor just collapse? That happened like twice back to back, what's one more? Anyway, Rayne wakes up in a cell where spikes are moments away from, well, spiking her. Raven Guy swoops back at him to make up for his earlier switch flipping based betrayal. Before freeing her, he drops his grand motive. He wants to be the hero by hunting down all vampires, by helping the vampire lord. Yeah, somehow they actually managed to top the stupid mince twist from the first game, and that's saying something. Hey, if that logic works, then I guess you guys can help Team Crossbody hit 1,000 subs by not subscribing to Team Crossbody. Boom, guaranteed growth. Let's pause for a minute. You know, I was still confused by this scene, so I went back to rewatch it, and I think it's implied that Raven Guy actually turned Rayne over to Brimstone. Why though? Brimstone were the ones who enlisted Rayne for the mission to begin with. Now I know what you're probably thinking, maybe they wanted to use Rayne to get close to Da-Malcom. Okay, sure, but what made them think that their soldiers could ever take Rayne in a fight? None of those guys even made it inside the castle, they all got shredded in the courtyard at the beginning of the game. And they've seen Rayne mow down way stronger enemies since. How would they possibly subdue her? And even if it was the plan, let's say Brimstone did want to use Rayne to get close to Da-Malcom, then what? Da-Malcom is way stronger than Rayne, so now they'll have to deal with both him and Rayne at the same time. What was the end game here? Like, genuinely, what was the plan? Where was I? Oh yeah, in order to make his stupid enforced betrayal into a stupid enforced redemption even more stupid enforced, he trades his gimmick, the ability to transform into a bird, and transfer it to Rayne, which allows her to escape her prison, but leaves Raven Guy to get spiked instead. I was going to do a whole tribute bit for this character, but what's the point if he's got nothing as a character? Wait for it didn't even bother to give him a name. Unless he turns into a Raven. There's a character called Raven in Teen Titans. Holy shit, how can I be so stupid? He has a name the entire time. I'm still not going to give him a tribute, fuck him. So Raheem, you will be missed. We get a reprise of the whole Flappy Bird section. Not to say it's the same though, this time we actually get some awesome bird-based combat. The Raven form is so much stronger than Ray's base form is kind of insulting, one-shotting enemies with her screech and casually knocking the already floating guy straight into the abyss, somehow. The level design here is pretty strange though. You're flying through the usual traps and hazards, but there's a ton of moving platforms clearly designed for Rayne to take advantage of. Which begs the question, was this Raven section just tacked on? Because it really feels like it. That last second gameplay edition vibe gets hammered in immediately because the very next level strips away your ability to cheese the platforming. How? By throwing in these anti-Raven spots, floating orbs that zap you the second you try to transform. And it's not like this mechanic shows up halfway through the stage or as a clever twist, nope, it's just slapped right at the start. So why even bother introducing a new skill if you're just going to immediately bench it? I mean, at least we get some pretty interesting platforming and combat sections out of it. After another blood-filled elevator thing, we finally catch up with Da-Malcom, and oh my god, he fuses with this random ass super demon that's just sitting there for some reason. He literally becomes a pile of guts, and somehow that's the final boss. Zeta Gamma seems like an intimidating boss at first, especially when he slams his fist and a bunch of rocks come crashing down on you. But there's some pretty ridiculous and silly ways to cheese this guy and avoid taking any damage at all, once you stop overthinking dodging his attacks. It's not a bad final boss, and honestly the second best boss in the game, but considering we had to fight Crab Puncher twice, that's not really much of an accomplishment, is it? I love that Zeta Gamma absolutely has no build up whatsoever. But as if to make up for it, the devs gave me a surprisingly satisfying method of dispatching them. Just grab the coffin driller and slam it on top of something. That simple act almost makes me forgive everything. I guess if you want to radicalize TCB to do something, just give us our coffin driller scene just bashing into stuff instead. You know, instead of liberal media. In typical Metroidvania fashion, there's an escape sequence where you have to, well, escape. Everything turns red and just infinitely more annoying, and you get nauseous because the camera keeps swaying left and right. I understand they had to do it to kind of pay tribute to Castlevania and all, but you know, it'd be rude if they didn't.
Time to pick out a random review and see if we agree with anything said. This review was brought to you by horror_spooky over at GameFAQ way back in the much simpler time of 2013. So about 2 years after Betrayal's original release. He writes,
"This game bites. BloodRayne used to be a fairly good yet unappreciated hack and slash Devil May Cry clone back in the day. Now the reputation of the series has been hugely tarnished by a series of laughably bad films from quite possibly the worst film director of all time, Uwe Boll. BloodRayne Betrayal is the video game equivalent of those awful BloodRayne films."
Yeah, BloodRayne was always fairly good, and it was always a little unappreciated, not by any large extent. In my opinion, it always felt like one of those you see what you get kind of games. I wouldn't be surprised if a large part of BloodRayne's failure as a franchise came from the 3 Uwe Boll films, but comparing Betrayal to those seems a little hyperbolic.
There's just so many things I don't like about this game that it's hard to keep it all straight. So I will start with the art style, which I actually thought was pretty good. The art style was modeled after anime with gothic lighting and colors to really give a sense of vampiric nobility. Animation is pretty fluid and overall the game looks good. Blood flying from enemies and other visual effects such as sparks flashing up from machinery and the like shows that there is at least some effort put into the visual quality. Lag often afflicts the game, however, and brings down the overall quality of its looks by a considerable margin.
Since we're coming from the far advanced future, we'll just look past the lag and comment. But yes, the game is very pretty, though I feel the art style doesn't really do much for the series as a whole, other than confuse people who aren't looking at the title. There's not much to complain about outside of the characters looking a little too simple for my taste, and a few repeated backdrops that are just recolored to appear different.
It's just everything else that's bad. The story is pointless and might as well have been completely scrapped. There's no thought or strategy that goes into the combat. It's as mindless as it gets, but it's also very difficult and frustrating due to the odd level design and ridiculous enemies that take forever to kill, slowing the pace to a virtual crawl.
Alright, dial it back a bit. Yes, the story is dog shit, no arguing that point. Characters and plot points pop out of nowhere and the entire cast basically have zero personality outside of Da-Malcom, who was just a quit machine. I have no idea what they were going for. This could have been corrected in the Fresh Bites version by bringing Bailey back, but they didn't take advantage of that at all. This dude is absolutely wrong about the combat, which I've actually gained a newfound respect for. I think Way Forward did a pretty amazing job combining all the overall ideas of both BloodRayne games and making them matter in distinctive ways, using something as simple as the scoring system to glue everything together. It works well. It's even more impressive that they managed to do it while transitioning the series into a 2D perspective. His take on the difficulties seems to miss the exact point we made earlier in the video. People want the button mash, but the game expects a little more from its players. Enemies don't take long to go down, especially if you use traps and environmental hazards to clear them out faster. Level design is mostly harmless and kinda bland, outside of a few standout platforming moments or cute little ideas sprinkled throughout.
Boss fights are generic and predictable, platforming is a chore, and exploring the environment is ultimately pointless. There are also no redeeming qualities about this game, except for the art style. Music, terrible. Gameplay, terrible. Replayability, good luck forcing yourself through this one even one time.
Much like the story, most of the boss fights are bad. There's like 4 in total and 2 of them are against the same guy. I already talked about the platforming is ultimately harmless, and what little exploring the game offers isn't pointless. It's always to get a skull which is used to power Rayne up. That's the complete opposite of pointless. Once again, my guy, dial it back. The game has tons of redeemable qualities. The music, although not my taste for BloodRayne, is more than fine on its own. The gameplay might have been the most focused it's ever been in the series, and it's far from terrible. Okay, the replayability is mostly non-existent, you won that round.
I think what the devs were going for was a game kinda like the 2D Castlevanias on the DS and GBA. Indeed, a BloodRayne game in that style could probably do very well. However, where those games have intense fast-paced combat, BloodRayne has slow, mindless, yawn-inducing combat. Where those games have expansive worlds full of secrets to discover, BloodRayne has some of the most painfully generic and outright boring level design I've ever encountered. Where those games are some of the best games I've ever played, BloodRayne Betrayal stands among one of the worst.
Yup, Betrayal is pretty mediocre compared to his main inspiration, which is obviously Castlevania to some degree. And honestly, I don't think an idea like this in the series would have been a terrible direction to take. This guy comes across like a BloodRayne fan who didn't like the pathway Flora went down, which probably dug a knife in a little deeper, making the game seem worse than it actually was. And hey, that's fine. If you just didn't vibe with the game, feel how you feel. But calling the game essentially worthless, yeah, that's a bit of a stretch. Betrayal isn't the best, hell, it isn't even way for its best. But it's a totally fine game if you play by its rules.
So yeah, BloodRayne Betrayal is a strange little experiment, isn't it? On paper, it's a solid 2D action platformer with some clever combat ideas and surprisingly deep mechanics for what seems like a smaller game. WayForward took the core ideas of the first 2 BloodRayne games and fused them together in a way that works more often than it doesn't. Even if the series' personality, like the quips and the Ground Heights vibe, is largely stripped away. It's pretty, it sounds fine, and it plays well once you get the hang of it, but it does feel like a BloodRayne game in name only. The story is nonsensical, the bosses are either recycled or boring, and Rayne herself barely talks. That said, there's something charming in how it tries to be a tactical, hazard-aware brawler, while still maintaining some of the old-school action vibes. Betrayal isn't perfect. Hell, it isn't even memorable. But it's not a complete failure either. Okay, it probably has to be by the very definition. And it's definitely one of the stranger ways for a franchise to go out. BloodRayne's biggest betrayal wasn't entirely wait for his decision making. It would be a just go for seemingly not caring enough about the series to give it a proper sequel. Something that would have gave it more of a fighting chance than a rinky-dink digital-only game. And that's why BloodRayne Betrayal is the best game in the series. Next time in this retrospective series, we'll be finishing things up with BloodRayne 2. Is it just me, or does anyone else feel radicalized? Hey, thank you for making it all the way to the end of the video. If you watched all the way towards this point, what's the harm of leaving a like, comment, or a subscribe? We also like to give a special shout out to Mega Tech Body for the good BloodRayne footage. Thank you, man. We'll see you next time.